Well, political writers and others are asking some new questions today about that Easter sermon attended by the president and the First Family, in which the minister of the church attacked what he called the captains of the Christian right for their stances on race, gender equality, gays, and immigrants. Now remember, pediatric neurosurgeon Dr. Ben Carson took a whole lot of heat for getting political at the National Prayer Breakfast about 2 months back. And here's what two of my guests who are joining us in moments had to say about Dr. Carson back in February.
I think it was inappropriate. I agree with his remarks. I wouldn't disagree with a single thing he said. It just wasn't the right venue for doing it, and in my view, didn't live up to the purpose of the breakfast.
All right, Alan, your thoughts?
What Cal said.
But to do it at the National Prayer Breakfast, which is a place where we're supposed to be celebrating humility, harmony, national unity, it was totally out of place. And I'm afraid it was such an indictment of what's wrong with Washington is there's no safe space anymore for comedy. There's no safe space to be free of ideological partisanship, polarization, all that stuff that turns the American people off.
So how do they feel now? Joining me now, Cal Thomas, who's a syndicated columnist and a Fox News contributor, Dan Gerstein, who's the president of Gotham Ghostwriters, and also, for good measure, Tony Perkins, who is president of the Family Research Council. He is on as a captain of the religious right, who we believe is one of the ones being attacked by the Reverend in that sermon. All right, let's go down the line, Cal. Do you feel the same about this Reverend making these remarks on Easter Sunday as you did about Dr. Carson at the National Prayer Breakfast?
Well, I did indeed, Megan. The big difference was, of course, that I agreed with everything, as I said, that Ben Carson said at the prayer breakfast, just the wrong venue. But when I first heard about this, my first reaction was, did this guy just climb out of a time capsule that was buried in the 1950s? Blacks in the back of the bus? Who's been talking about that for decades? That's ridiculous. And to sit there with the President of the United States and give a political sermon when it's Easter Sunday and you're supposed to be preaching about the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, was unbelievably inappropriate. I can't believe what got into him. Maybe he succumbed to a kind of temptation that is all too prevalent in this town, the temptation to settle for a lower kingdom when you ought to be referring to a higher one.
Well, and Charles Crownhammer was suggesting he may have been settling for the kingdom of the press, knowing that the press was there, and maybe he wanted to make a splash. Now, I do want to let our viewers know, because I didn't read the quote from the Reverend on Easter Sunday. He said, "It drives me crazy when the captains of the religious right are always calling people back. For blacks to be back in the back of the bus, for women to be back in the kitchen, for gays to be in the closet, and for immigrants to be on their side of the border." How about you, Dan? Do you condemn this in the way you did Dr. Carson?
Oh, yeah, I think what he said was totally inappropriate and really inaccurate. There is very much a problem that deserves addressing, which is there are some on the right that, whether it's the immigration debate, whether it's gay marriage debate, their views are shaped and distorted by bigotry. There's no question about that. But the language he used was so overbroad, unfair, and inaccurate. I mean, I think Tony could speak to this. There's a big segment of the evangelical community that's actually playing a very constructive role in trying to get immigration reform passed. So to somehow have a blanket indictment like that is not only unfair, it's destructive because it prevents us from dealing with what is a real problem, but by blowing it out of proportion and being unfair in the way you're characterizing.
Tony, how alienating is that for you as somebody who's been openly religious and a Christian conservative to hear, you know, folks who believe as you do, that what you really want is you want blacks in the back of the bus, you want women back in the kitchen, you want gays in the closet, and you want immigrants back on their side of the border?
Well, his comments really, the merits of those don't even deserve to be addressed. But I will say this, I appreciate the fact that I've been promoted. You know, I was a sergeant in the Marine Corps, now I'm a captain. I'm glad for that. But let me say this, I actually defend his right to say what he said. The question here is not, did he have the right to enter into what some would say political speech in the pulpit? The double standard here is what reaches out to me. Where are the hounds of the separation of church and state that hounded John McCain back in 2008, trying to get him to denounce pastors who had endorsed him because they had made politically incorrect statements regarding issues that are covered in the Bible? Or Rick Santorum last spring, where the media hounded him, trying to get him to denounce pastors. So it's the double standard. Now, going to the context of what he had to say, I mean, it's obvious he missed his hermeneutics class and doesn't really know how to apply Scripture in this particular case. But I defend his right to say what he wants to say in his pulpit. But the president should be called upon to say, hey, I don't agree with what he said.
Well, that's the question, too.
As Cal said,
that's the question, too. I want to get to that, Cal, because the president, in his defense, all presidents have gone to this church. I mean, not all, but many presidents have gone to this church. And there wasn't, as far as I can see, any reason to believe that Reverend Leon was going to go there. So let's give him the benefit of the doubt and say the First Family was caught a little off guard.
Right.
Then Jay Carney was asked about it yesterday and declined to denounce it or comment really on it in any way. Should he have said, look, we don't condone that. We don't agree with what he said, period.
Yeah, I think that's would be perfectly legitimate, or to say, the president was caught off guard. I think he was ambushed in this case. Look, I used to go to church with Jimmy Carter back in the 1970s, First Baptist Church here in Washington. Heard him teach Sunday school. He never got political. When they had guest teachers, and I was one Sunday, by the way, we never got political. And I don't recall the preacher at that church ever getting political. So this is, it's not a relatively new phenomenon, but I think the religious left is picking up on what they perceive as the belief system and the activities and the political activism of the so-called religious right from the 1980s, and think that they can do it now because those folks in the 1980s did it.
I want to ask you, Dan, because Bob Beckel was another man who was tough on Dr. Carson after his comments on the National Prayer Breakfast, and he got to speak about the Reverend and the Easter Sunday sermon last night on the 5. Here's Bob then and now. Watch.
It is not a place to be giving political statements. But I'm telling you, I thought it was just inappropriate. Do I think it was a good message on Easter Sunday?
No.
No. Do I think that the only reason we're running this story is because Obama was in this church? Of course that's why we're running the story, so that all you conservatives could beat up on him.
Your thoughts on that?
Well, there's a nugget of truth to that this story gets elevated because the president was there. But I want to go to what Tony said.
As did the Dr. Carson event.
Absolutely. I want to go to the point Tony made, which is very important. And this is endemic in our politics. There is selective outrage being practiced by both sides, and it's got to stop. There's too much intolerance coming out of the left and the right, and it's killing our political debates. We've lost the vocabulary of disagreement, and now in religious settings, we no longer have the ability to differentiate between the sin and the sinner. It's possible to hate the sin, but still love the sinner. And I think we've got to pull back from that. And I'd actually love to see President Obama address this, because I think there's a real opportunity for him to rise above this and sort of say, listen, we've got to stop with this demonization. We've got to stop with the tribalism, so that when our side says it, it's okay, and when their side says it, it's wrong and horrible. Intolerance is intolerance, no matter where it's practiced.
Tony, what do you make of that? Because it seems like some have given a pass to those who would criticize Christians, conservative Christians, and their views on gay marriage, for example, because they just say, look, you are just bigots. That's just all there is to it. You're bigots if you're not behind gay rights, and that's, the civil rights issue of our time, and therefore if you're on the wrong side of it, you deserve to be condemned.
Well, as was stated, I mean, he rolled into this statement he made on Sunday some very, very loaded language to portray those who would be against the redefinition of marriage as if they were bigots that wanted to see African Americans at the back of the bus and women back in the kitchen. As Cal said, I don't know what time capsule he came out of, but clearly he's not able to discern the difference between those issues. But again, it goes back to the double standard. I'm fine with him saying whatever he wants to say from his pulpit, but the same standard should apply to him as it applies to some Southern Baptist preacher down in my home state of Louisiana or Arkansas or somewhere else. It should be the same standard that the media and the left pursues.
Well, Megyn, then I'd love to, I totally agree with Tony, and I'd love to see him then practice that consistent standard in condemning what Dr. Carson said the other night on Sean Hannity's show, which was very hateful and offensive to gays and lesbians in this country, and unfortunately reinforces the perception, which I think is unfair.
Well, we already had that debate. We don't have Dr. Carson represented here, but we already had a fair and balanced debate on whether that was a hateful statement by Dr. Carson when he said he's not for gay marriage, same as he's not for any union outside of a man and woman, and he mentioned bestiality and NAMBLA, two very controversial issues.
Right, but
we already had a fair and balanced debate about whether he was trying to compare those groups or just searching.
We need to hear from our friends on the right to condemn hateful things like that.
Great job, you guys. Thank you all.
Free speech. Let's have those debates. Let's not shut it down.
All right.
That's
I gotta go because I gotta go debate Michael Jackson.